I burned churches, jailed pastors, and personally signed the orders that destroyed dozens of Christian families across the Gulf. Then I died on an operating table, and Jesus showed me everything I had been fighting against my entire life. What I saw during those 48 hours cannot be explained by any doctor or scientist on this earth. I came back with information that no living person should possess, and the men who once called me a defender of the faith now want me permanently silenced before I can tell the world what Jesus showed me. My name is Zaid Al-Harani. I am a former prince and the senior religious enforcement official from Saudi Arabia, currently living in an undisclosed location in Western Europe. What I am about to share with you will challenge everything you have ever been taught about death, about heaven, about Jesus, and about the God who made you. Power does not feel like power when you are born inside it. It feels like air. It feels like the natural condition of existence. You breathe it without noticing it the same way you breathe oxygen, without gratitude, and without awareness that most people on earth never get even a single breath of what you take in constantly every day of your life. I was born in the Najd region of Saudi Arabia, the heartland of the kingdom, the place where the religious and political foundations of the Saudi state were first hammered together centuries ago. My family was not simply wealthy. My family was woven into the original fabric of the Saudi state in a way that made our identity and the kingdom's identity almost impossible to separate. We were connected to the religious establishment, the royal family, and the security apparatus simultaneously through bloodlines and marriages and alliances built over generations. My grandfather had been a senior religious judge under a previous king. My father served in the Committee for the Promotion of Virtue and the Prevention of Vice, the religious police that enforced Islamic law in public life across the kingdom. My uncles held positions in the military and in intelligence. Growing up in my family was like growing up inside the engine room of a machine that ran an entire country. You understood from a very early age that you were not an ordinary person. You understood that your family had responsibilities to God and to the kingdom that ordinary families did not carry. My father was a strict and serious man who loved me deeply in the way that very strict and serious men love their children, through expectation and through the rigorous preparation of that child for a life of meaningful service. He was not a cold man. He could laugh and tell stories and show genuine warmth to those close to him. But he was always teaching, always shaping, always pressing me in the direction of the man he believed I was born to become. From my earliest years, my education was intense and specifically directed. I memorized large sections of the Quran before I was old enough to fully understand what I was memorizing. I studied Arabic grammar and Islamic jurisprudence and the biographies of the Prophet's companions with the scholars who came to our home specifically to teach the children of important families. I learned the theological framework that justified every aspect of the Saudi religious and political order. I learned why our version of Islam was correct and why all others were either incomplete or outright heresy. I was taught about Christians from an early age, not with hatred exactly. The theology was more nuanced than simple hatred, at least in its formal presentation. Christians were described as people who had once received a true revelation from God, but had corrupted it over time. Their scriptures had been altered from the original. Their beliefs about Jesus as the Son of God were described as a fundamental theological error, a form of associating partners with the one true God that was considered among the most serious sins in Islamic theology. Christians were to be tolerated as a category of people, but their faith was not to be respected as a valid path to God, and their attempts to share that faith with Muslims were to be resisted and prevented with whatever force was necessary. This framing made perfect sense to me as a young man. I was not taught to hate Christian people as individuals. I was taught to consider their religion a corrupted and dangerous deviation from the truth that Islam had preserved intact. The distinction felt important and even somewhat generous to my young mind. We were not persecuting people. We were protecting truth. We were defending Muslims from spiritual misinformation the same way a responsible government protects its citizens from harmful substances. I held on to that framing for the next 30 years and it justified everything I did. I joined the religious enforcement apparatus after completing my studies. My family connections opened doors that would have taken an ordinary man a decade of performance to reach. Within a few years, I held a senior position overseeing religious compliance operations in a large region of the kingdom. My responsibilities included monitoring for violations of Islamic religious law in public spaces, investigating reports of illegal religious activity, and coordinating with intelligence services when cases rose to the level of serious security concern. The cases I found most personally significant were the Christian cases: underground churches, secret Bible study groups, missionaries operating under business or tourist cover, Saudi nationals who had somehow encountered Christianity and were privately exploring it, or in the most serious cases, had actually converted. These cases were, in my mind, not simply legal violations to be processed through the system. They were frontline battles in a spiritual war for the souls of Muslims. I approached these cases with a level of personal investment and energy that went beyond professional duty. I built a network of informants across my region who reported any signs of Christian activity. I developed expertise in the methods that missionaries used to operate covertly. I knew which social media platforms they favored and how they encrypted their communications, and which neighborhoods in major cities had concentrations of foreign workers from heavily Christian countries who might be used as distribution networks for Christian materials. When my teams identified a case, I moved on it decisively. In my years in this position, I shut down dozens of underground gathering points. I confiscated thousands of Bibles and Christian books and electronic devices containing Christian content. I oversaw the interrogation of hundreds of people suspected of Christian religious activity. I authorized the deportation of foreign nationals caught engaging in missionary work. I signed the paperwork that sent Saudi nationals who had converted to Christian faith into the detention system, where they faced pressure to recant and return to Islam. I never personally tortured anyone. I want to be clear about that. Not because it changes the moral weight of what I did, but because it is accurate. I ran a system. I made decisions. I signed orders. The consequences of those orders were carried out by other people in rooms I was not present in. The distance between my signature and the suffering it caused was the distance I used to maintain the self-image of a man who was simply doing his duty faithfully and professionally. There was a particular case in the third year of my senior role that I think about more than any other. A young Saudi woman named Dina, a university student in her early 20s, had been reported to my department by a family member who was concerned about changes in her behavior. When my team investigated, they found that she had been meeting secretly with a small group of other young Saudis who had all independently come to faith in Jesus through online content and underground networks. She was not organizing anything. She was not trying to convert other people. She was simply a young woman who had found something that had changed her life and was meeting with others who had experienced the same thing to read the Bible together and pray. I reviewed her case file personally. I read the transcripts of her initial interview. I read her own written statement in which she explained her faith with a simplicity and a clarity that I found deeply unsettling even at the time. She wrote that she had not been seeking Christianity. She had been seeking God, and she had found a God who spoke to her personally and loved her specifically and had changed everything inside her. She wrote that she was not trying to harm anyone or undermine anything. She only wanted to know and follow this God she had found. I read her statement and I put it in the file and I processed her case through the system. She was detained for several months. Her family was notified and brought in to facilitate her return to Islam. I do not know exactly what happened to her during those months of detention because by the time the case was closed on my records, I had moved on to the next file. But her face stayed with me and her words stayed with me. She had written that she had found a God who spoke to her personally. I had been a devout Muslim my entire life. I had prayed 5 times every day for decades. I had fasted and given to charity and gone on Hajj and memorized the Quran and studied theology with the finest scholars in the kingdom. And not once in all of that religious activity had I ever felt that God had spoken to me personally. Not once had I felt anything except the satisfaction of duty performed and ritual completed correctly. I pushed that observation away quickly because it was dangerous. It was the kind of thought that could unravel a man who allowed it to develop. I told myself that faith was not about feeling. Faith was about obedience. Emotion was unreliable. Doctrine was solid. I returned to my work. The years accumulated. The cases accumulated. The names and faces in the files accumulated. My position grew more senior and my influence expanded. I became known within the religious enforcement establishment as one of the most effective operators in the kingdom at identifying and neutralizing underground Christian activity. I received commendations and recognition from religious authorities. I was invited to present on my methods at conferences attended by officials from other Gulf countries who wanted to replicate my results in their own territories. I was, by every available measure, a success. And I was deeply and quietly and completely miserable in a way that I had no language for and no safe person to tell. The misery did not announce itself. It crept in the way water seeps through a foundation, invisibly and gradually, until the day the structural damage becomes impossible to ignore. I was somewhere in my late 40s when I first noticed that the certainty that had driven me for my entire career was thinning at the edges like old fabric that has been washed too many times. The theology was the same, the arguments were the same, but something in the interior region where conviction lives had become slightly hollow, slightly mechanical, slightly like a recording of the original thing rather than the original thing itself. I began having trouble sleeping. Not the acute insomnia of a man with a specific problem consuming his mind, but the low-grade chronic sleeplessness of a man whose mind will not fully commit to rest because something unresolved keeps pulling it back toward wakefulness. I would lie in the darkness of my bedroom in my large house in Riyadh, and I would find my mind wandering to files and cases, not reviewing them professionally, simply seeing faces, simply hearing sentences. Dina's words came back to me repeatedly during these sleepless hours. I found a God who spoke to me personally. I had thought about those words far more often than I should have for a man in my position. I thought about them the way you think about a stone in your shoe that you cannot stop to remove, with irritation and with the persistent awareness that it is affecting how you walk. I became more rigorous about my personal religious practice during this period. The way a man with a leaking boat bails water faster rather than looking for the hole. I added extra prayers. I increased my Quran reading. I gave more money to charity. I was hoping that more religion would fill the hollowness that was growing in the center of my religious life. It did not. The political changes sweeping through the kingdom during those years added another layer of disorientation. The religious enforcement apparatus that I had served my entire career was being significantly restructured. Powers that my organization had held for decades were being curtailed. The religious police were being reined in publicly in ways that would have been unthinkable a generation earlier. The kingdom was modernizing in selective and managed ways, allowing entertainment and mixed public spaces and certain social freedoms that had previously been strictly forbidden. I understood the political logic. I even understood some of the genuine social benefit, but it created a profound confusion in my interior landscape because I had organized my entire sense of purpose and identity around being a guardian of a specific religious order. If that order was being revised from the top, what exactly had I been guarding? If the things I had been enforcing for 30 years were now being quietly relaxed by the same royal authority that had commissioned me to enforce them, what was the meaning of all those files and all those cases and all those faces? I did not share these thoughts with anyone. In my world, there was no safe space for this kind of questioning. Doubt was not treated as a natural part of a thinking person's inner life. It was treated as a symptom of spiritual weakness, or worse, as evidence of corrupting outside influence. A man in my position who began asking loud questions about the foundations of his work would find his career and possibly his freedom in immediate jeopardy. So I kept the questions locked in the same interior space where Dina's words had been living for years, and I waited without knowing what I was waiting for. The physical crisis arrived without warning on an ordinary afternoon. I was in my office reviewing reports when I felt a sudden and catastrophic pain in my abdomen that was so severe it took my breath away completely. I managed to press the emergency button on my desk before I lost consciousness. My staff found me on the floor. An ambulance was called immediately, and I was rushed to a private hospital that served senior government officials. The diagnosis was a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. My aorta, the largest blood vessel in the body, had torn open internally. I was bleeding catastrophically from the inside. The surgical team that worked on me that evening did everything that modern medical science could do for a man in my condition. They operated for hours. They fought to repair the damage and to restore blood flow to my vital organs. They were not successful enough. My heart stopped during surgery. Then it stopped again. The medical team brought me back the first time. The second time, despite everything they did, I remained clinically dead for a period that my chief surgeon would later tell me, with an expression I had never seen on a doctor's face before, was medically inexplicable in terms of the outcome. I was dead by every clinical definition available to modern medicine for 48 hours. And I was not unconscious for a single moment of it. I want to describe what I experienced during those 48 hours as accurately as human language will allow. I am aware that human language was built to describe human experience, and what I am about to describe is not within the range of human experience as most people understand it. I will do my best. I ask you to stay with me. The first thing I became aware of was that I was no longer in the hospital. This awareness did not arrive with the drama of a sudden transition. There was no flash or tunnel or spinning sensation of the kind that you might have heard described in near-death experiences reported in the media. One moment I was aware of pain and medical chaos and the sound of urgent voices. And then those things were simply gone. And I was somewhere else entirely, with the naturalness of turning a page. I was standing on something solid that I could not identify as any material I recognized. The ground beneath my feet was real and firm, but it was not earth or stone or metal or wood or any manufactured surface. It was simply there, supporting me, present without being classifiable. Around me stretched an environment of such overwhelming beauty that describing it feels like trying to describe an ocean using a single cup of water. There was light, but it was not light produced by any source I could identify. It seemed to come from everywhere simultaneously, and to be the medium through which everything else existed, rather than a feature added to an already existing landscape. The light was warm and intelligent. I know that sounds strange. Light cannot be intelligent in the physical world, but this light was aware. I felt it the same way you feel the attention to another person when they are focused entirely on you. There were colors that I do not have names for. This is not poetic language. I mean it precisely. The human visual spectrum contains a specific range of wavelengths, and the colors I was seeing in this place existed clearly and distinctly outside that range. They registered not through my eyes, but through whatever faculty of perception I was using in this state. They were magnificent in a way that made every beautiful thing I had ever seen in my physical life seem like a rough sketch of beauty, rather than beauty itself. There were other presences in this place. I could sense them rather than see them in any conventional way. They were luminous. They moved with a joy that was so complete and so unself-conscious that watching them made me feel simultaneously uplifted and devastated by the contrast with every experience of joy I had ever had in my physical life. Those experiences had all been joy with an asterisk, joy that was partial, joy that was aware of its own limits and its own coming end. The joy of these presences had no asterisk. It was total and permanent and as natural to them as breathing had been to me. I stood there taking all of this in and feeling something I had not expected to feel in this place. I felt small, not small in the diminishing way that powerful people fear. Small in the way that a person feels when they stand at the edge of a great ocean or beneath a sky full of stars. Small in proportion to something genuinely vast that makes your smallness feel like belonging rather than inadequacy. Then I became aware that someone was approaching me. The approach was different from anything else in this place. Where the other presences were luminous, this one was luminosity itself. Where the others radiated joy, this one was the source from which joy originated. I cannot tell you how I knew who it was before I could see any features or hear any voice. That I simply knew, the way you know the voice of someone you love when you hear it in a crowded room before you can locate them. Recognition arrived before perception. Jesus was walking toward me. I had spent 30 years of my professional life working to suppress and contain and eliminate the influence of Jesus in my part of the world. I had read about him in Islamic theology as a respected prophet who had been misunderstood and misrepresented by his followers. I had never in my life entertained the serious possibility that he was anything more than that. The idea that he was the Son of God, that he was divine, that he was in any meaningful sense God walking among men, had been categorized in my mind under the heading of corrupted theology and filed away permanently. Every category I had built collapsed the moment he came close enough for me to perceive him fully. He was not simply a powerful being. He was not simply a highly enlightened spiritual figure. He was the foundation, the thing that everything else in this place was built on. The reason the light was warm and intelligent was because it came from him. The reason the joy of those other presences was total and permanent was because it was rooted in their relationship to him. Everything in heaven was what it was because Jesus was what he was. I understood this not through argument or explanation, but through direct perception, the way you understand that the sun is the source of warmth by walking out of shadow into sunlight. He stopped a few feet from where I was standing and he looked at me. I have been looked at by kings and princes and generals and religious authorities my entire life. I have been in rooms where very powerful people directed their full attention at me. I know what it feels like to be seen by powerful people. What I felt when Jesus looked at me was completely unlike any of that. He was not assessing me. He was not measuring me against a standard. He was not deciding what category to place me in. He was simply seeing me, all of me. Every room I had ever been in, every file I had ever signed, every face I had processed and moved past, every question I had looked away, every sleepless night, every hollow prayer. He saw all of it and he did not look away. He said my name. He said Zaid in a voice that made every other time my name had been spoken feel like a shadow of this moment. And then he said something that I was entirely unprepared to hear. He said, I have been with you the whole time. I did not know what to do with that sentence. I still do not fully know what to do with it. I had spent my entire adult life actively working against him, and he was telling me that he had been present for all of it, not as a distant, disapproving observer, present with me. The way the word was spoken made it feel like closeness rather than surveillance, like love rather than judgment. I fell to my knees. Not as a practiced act of religious submission, my legs simply gave way beneath me, the way they would if the ground itself became too holy to stand on casually. Then Jesus began to show me things. And this is the part of my testimony that I want you to pay very careful attention to, because what he showed me during those hours is the reason I am speaking to you today. It is the information that the men who once paid my salary do not want you to hear. It is the truth that I was sent back to carry. He showed me heaven the way a teacher shows a student something important, not as a passive observer being carried through scenes, but as someone actively learning, being walked through truths that had been waiting for me. He showed me the nature of the place I was standing in. He showed me that heaven was not a reward given to people who had successfully completed a checklist of religious requirements. It was a relationship. It was the natural environment of souls who had chosen to be in relationship with the God who made them. The joy I had seen in those other presences was the joy of people who were doing what they were made to do, existing in the presence of the love that had created them, the same way a fish is most fully itself in water. He showed me something about the people I had spent my career persecuting. He showed me Dina, the young university student whose file I had processed years before, without allowing myself to fully see her as a person. He showed her to me now in this place, in the presence of the love that she had found and that I had tried to extinguish. She was radiant. She was completely and permanently at home, in a way that my memory of her frightened face in a detention file had never prepared me to imagine. She was exactly what she had written in her statement. She had found a God who spoke to her personally. And in this place, I could see that she had been right about everything. Jesus showed me the others, the missionaries I had deported, and the believers I had processed through the detention system, and the small group I had shut down across my region over 3 decades. He did not show them to me as an accusation. He showed them to me so that I could see what I had actually been fighting against. I had told myself I was fighting against theological error and the spiritual corruption and foreign influence. He showed me that I had been fighting against people who were finding their way home, people who had found the same thing I was standing in the middle of right now. The weight of that understanding was the most physically overwhelming thing I have ever experienced. And I say physically deliberately because even in that non-physical state, it had the quality of physical sensation. It pressed down on me like gravity multiplied 100 times. I had not been protecting people from error. I had been standing between people and the most important thing in the universe. I asked Jesus a question. I asked it out loud without planning to. The way questions escape you when the answer is suddenly urgently necessary. I asked him why. Why had he allowed me to do what I had done for so many years? Why had he not stopped me? Why had he not sent some kind of intervention before 30 years of damage had been done? Jesus looked at me, and the love in his eyes did not change at all when he answered. He said that every moment I had spent in that work had been a moment I had been free to choose differently. He said that the people I had persecuted had been in his hands the entire time, that not a single soul I had touched had been lost to him because of what I had done. He said that some of the most extraordinary stories of transformation in that entire region had their beginning in the persecution I had helped to carry out, because pressure produces diamonds, and the suffering of his people had produced testimonies that had reached further and burned brighter than easy comfort ever would have. He said that he had been pursuing me for 30 years, and that this moment, this conversation, was not his backup plan. It was the plan. I wept in heaven. I did not know that was possible. But I wept, and Jesus did not tell me to stop. He sat with me in it the way you sit with someone who needs to cry without rushing them toward the part where the crying is finished. He let me feel the full weight of what my life had been. He did not minimize it or explain it away. He held it with me. Then, when the weeping had finished its necessary work, he showed me more. He showed me things about the nature of God that I had never encountered in 30 years of serious Islamic theology study. He showed me that the God who made the universe was not a distant sovereign issuing commands from an unreachable throne. He was a father. I had encountered that language in Christian contexts before and dismissed it as the theological error I had been taught it was. Now I was perceiving it directly, not as a metaphor, but as a description of something structurally true about the nature of reality. The universe was made by love, for love, as the context or in which love between the creator and the created could happen. Every human being who had ever lived had been made to be in this relationship, not to achieve it, not to earn access to it through correct performance of religious duties, to enter it the way a child enters a room where their father is waiting. He showed me what had been available to me my entire life, that I had never been able to access. Not because God had withheld it, because the system I was part of had been built by men who were afraid of what direct relationship with God would mean for their own power. A man who knows God personally does not need an institution to stand between him and God and extract obedience at the price of access. The religious enforcement apparatus I had served for 3 decades was built at its foundation not to serve God but to serve the men who claimed to represent God, and I had spent my entire career as one of its most effective tools. Jesus showed me hell. I need to say this plainly because some people who hear near-death testimonies want to hear only about the beauty and the love and prefer to believe that the difficult realities do not exist. They exist. I saw a place that was the precise opposite of everything I had been standing in, where heaven was presence and warmth and light and relationship. What I saw was absence, not fire in the cartoonish sense that popular imagination pictures. Absence. The total and permanent withdrawal of the presence of God from a soul that had spent its earthly life refusing Him. The suffering of that place was the suffering of a soul experiencing what it chose, the complete fulfillment of the decision to live without God, carried forward into eternity without the mercy of unconsciousness or end. I saw people there who had believed, as I had believed for most of my life, that religious performance and doctrinal correctness were the same thing as knowing God. People who had been so certain of their righteousness that they had never once stood before God in genuine honesty and acknowledged that they needed Him. Their certainty had been the wall between them and the very thing they thought they were serving. That image stayed with me more than almost anything else from those 48 hours. The idea that a man could spend his entire life in the service of religion and end up in the place designed for the absence of God, not because he had been wicked in the obvious sense, because he had never actually come home. He had only ever stood on the porch performing the rituals of homecoming without ever walking through the door. Jesus and I talked. That is the simplest and most accurate way to describe what happened across those hours. We talked the way people talk when all pretense has been stripped away and there is nothing left to manage or protect. I asked every question I had locked away for decades, every uncomfortable observation that I had suppressed because it was unsafe, every doubt I had dismissed before it could fully form. Jesus answered all of them with a patience and a precision that told me He had been waiting for me to ask for a very long time. He told me things about the scriptures that illuminated passages I had studied academically without ever understanding. He showed me how the entire arc of the Bible was the story of a God who refused to give up on the people He had made, who pursued them across every era of human history, who sent prophet after prophet, and finally came Himself in the person of Jesus to do what no religious system and no human effort could do, to restore the broken relationship between God and the people He had made to love Him. He told me that the Bible I had been trained to dismiss as a corrupted text was more reliable and more alive than I had been told. He told me that the theological arguments I had used for years to justify my dismissal of Christian scripture were themselves built on foundations that would not hold under honest examination. He told me that the truth was available to anyone willing to look at it honestly, and that honest looking was the one thing that the system I had served worked hardest to prevent. Toward the end of those 48 hours, Jesus told me it was time to go back. I did not want to go back. I want to say that plainly because it is true and because I think it is important. After 48 hours in that place, the prospect of returning to a physical body in a hospital in Riyadh and resuming a life in the world felt like being asked to walk back into a cave after standing in the open sun. Not because the world was without value, but because what I had experienced was so vastly more real than anything the physical world could offer that the adjustment felt genuinely painful. Jesus told me that I was going back because there were people who needed to hear what I had seen. He told me that the things He had shown me were not for my benefit alone. He told me that my position, my background, my 30 years inside the religious enforcement apparatus of the Saudi state made me a specific and necessary witness. He told me that the people of the Middle East and the Muslim world needed to hear this testimony from someone whose credentials they could not easily dismiss. He told me that every face I had seen in those files, every believer I had processed through the detention system, every small group I had shut down, I had been praying that someone like me would have exactly this encounter. He told me that going back was not a punishment, it was an assignment. He reached out and touched my forehead with one hand. The warmth that moved through me from that touch was the warmth of the entire 48 hours condensed into a single instant. And then the light began to change and I felt the pull of gravity and weight and the returning awareness of physical pain and the sharp smell of hospital antiseptic and the sound of medical equipment and voices saying his name is back, he is back, watch the monitors, someone call the surgeon. I opened my eyes in a hospital in Riyadh, and I was a completely different person than the one who had closed them. The first person I saw when I fully regained consciousness was my chief surgeon, Dr. Mahmoud Azari. He was standing at the foot of my bed with a clipboard in his hands and an expression on his face that I had never seen on a doctor before. He looked like a man who had just witnessed something that his training had not prepared him for, and that he was not entirely sure how to document correctly. He told me that I had been clinically dead for 48 hours. He told me that my brain had been deprived of adequate oxygen for a period that should have resulted in severe and permanent neurological damage. He told me that the team had continued resuscitation efforts far beyond the standard protocols because of my position and because a family member who was a senior official had demanded they continue. He told me that when my heart finally restarted, it did so without any of the gradual return to rhythm that typically follows extended resuscitation. It simply began beating again, strongly and regularly, as if it had simply decided to. He told me he had no medical explanation for my neurological condition. By every measure they had run, my brain was functioning as well, or better than before the event. He said that in 30 years of cardiac surgery, he had never seen anything like it. He used the word inexplicable 3 times in that first conversation. I thanked him, and I asked for water, and I asked everyone to give me a moment alone. When the room was empty, I lay in that hospital bed, and I stared at the ceiling, and I held everything that had happened to me the way you hold something precious and fragile that you are afraid of dropping. I had been to heaven. I had spoken with Jesus. I had been shown things that no living person should possess knowledge of. And I had been sent back specifically to tell the world what I had seen. The practical problem with that assignment was significant. I was a senior official in the Saudi religious enforcement apparatus, currently lying in a private hospital that served senior government figures, surrounded by people whose professional purpose included monitoring exactly the kind of ideological shift I had just experienced. The world I was returning to was not a world that would receive my testimony with open arms. It was a world that would treat my testimony as the most serious possible threat to the order it existed to protect. I spent 3 weeks in that hospital recovering physically. I performed the required prayers at the required times. I received visitors from the government and the religious establishment who came to wish me well, and I greeted them with the appropriate words and the appropriate expressions. Inside, I was in a state of internal revolution. It's so total and so permanent that maintaining the surface of my old identity felt like wearing a costume from a play I had already left. My wife Mariam came every day. She sat beside my bed and held my hand, and told me about the children and about the house and about the prayers the family had offered for my recovery. She was the most faithful and devoted woman I had ever known, and I loved her more clearly in those hospital days than I had ever been able to express in the busy decades of our marriage. I wanted desperately to tell her everything. I wanted to tell her where I had been and what I had seen and who I had met and what he had said to me, but the risk was too enormous. Not because I doubted her love, because I knew that the world we lived in made honest conversation about these things genuinely dangerous for her, even if she responded with nothing but support. I kept silent and I planned. After my release from the hospital, I spent several months at home officially recovering. During this time, I used the skills I had spent 3 decades developing for the purpose of surveillance and counterintelligence, now turned in the opposite direction. I identified secure communication channels. I researched underground Christian networks in the Gulf region using knowledge I had previously used to dismantle those same networks. I began making quiet contact with people who could help me with what came next. I also began writing. Every night after the household was asleep, I sat at a small desk in my study and I wrote down everything I had seen and heard. During those 48 hours, I wrote with the discipline of a man who knows that the document he is creating is the most important document he has ever produced and that its loss would be irreplaceable. I wrote about the light and the presences and the conversations and the things Jesus had shown me. I wrote with as much precision and as much honesty as language allowed. I wrote about Dina. I wrote about every face Jesus had shown me from my 30 years of files. I wrote their names when I knew them and their faces when I did not. I wrote it all down as an act of witness and as an act of acknowledgement that these were real people who had carried real courage and whose stories deserved to be told alongside mine. The contact I needed eventually came through a chain of connections so indirect and so carefully constructed that I genuinely marveled at the organizational capability of people who operated with none of my resources and all of my opposition. A message reached me through 3 layers of intermediary. It was from an Arab Christian pastor I will call Brother Elias, who had been helping believers escape dangerous situations in the Gulf region for over a decade. He had heard through his network that a senior Saudi official had experienced something significant during a medical crisis and was looking for a way out. Brother Elias and I communicated for several weeks before we met in person. He was extraordinarily careful, and I respected that completely. When we finally met in a location I will not describe, he was a quiet and calm man with the eyes of someone who had seen a great deal and had been sustained through it by something more reliable than his own strength. He listened to my account of what had happened to me with a stillness and an attention that felt like reverence. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said that he had been praying for years that God would reach the men who ran the systems that persecuted his people. He said that my sitting in front of him was an answer to a prayer he had almost given up on. He said almost with a smile that made clear he had not actually given up on it at all. With Brother Elias's help and using a combination of legitimate travel arrangements and documents that I will not detail here, I left Saudi Arabia. I left my position and my house and the structures of power and identity I had inhabited my entire life. I left Mariam behind temporarily and with a grief that I carried like a physical injury every day since. I left my children behind. I left everything I had accumulated and everything I had been. I took one thing with me, a small notebook in which I had written down everything Jesus had shown me during 48 hours outside of time. The months since my departure have been the most difficult and the most alive of my existence. Difficult because of the grief and the isolation and the permanent weight of what I left behind. Then alive because for the first time I am living in the truth completely. Without a surface that contradicts my interior, without a costume over the person I actually am. Mariam has been told the truth now. Through careful channels over many months, I have shared everything with her. What happened to me, what I saw, who I met, and what I was sent back to say. Her response has been the most extraordinary thing I have witnessed since I came back from heaven itself. She has not condemned me. She has not reported me. She has asked it for a Bible. I asked Brother Elias to get one to her through his network. It arrived 3 weeks later. In the first message she sent me after receiving it, she wrote one sentence. She wrote, "I think I understand now why you could not come back. My son Nabil has made contact with me through an intermediary. He is 19 and angry and confused and heartbroken, but he is also asking questions. He wants to understand what his father saw that changed everything. I pray for him every single day with the same love and urgency that Jesus showed me was always being directed at me. During all those years, I was pointing it elsewhere. I am speaking publicly today because Jesus told me that what he showed me was not for me alone. I am speaking because every person watching this deserves to hear the truth that I was shown, that God is not a distant authority figure requiring performance, that Jesus is not a corrupted prophet misrepresented by his followers, that heaven is real and it is what every human soul was made for, that no man is too far gone and no career is too dark and no history is too bloody. For the reach of the love that met me in that place, I was dead for 48 hours. I stood in the presence of Jesus and I saw the reality that every religion and every philosophy and every human heart reaching toward without always knowing what it is reaching for. I came back with one message, and I will spend whatever time remains in my physical life delivering it to everyone who will listen. The door is open. It has always been open. Jesus is standing at it right now with the patience of someone who has been waiting since before you were born and who will still be there when every other option you have tried has run out. My name is Zaid Al-Harani. I was a hunter of the church for 30 years. I am a witness to heaven today. And if that transformation is possible for a man like me, there is not a single person watching this for whom it is not possible. If what I have shared has reached something real in you today, write in the comments, "I want to come home." Let those 4 words be your first honest step toward the door that has been waiting for you your entire life. He has been with you the whole time.